you're working in your dream job, inside your dream company, when you've been asked to make an important decision. And that decision is about who you're going to hire for a national sales director role. The recruiter has narrowed down the candidates to 4, and you're about to meet them. Candidate A is an East Asian man in his late 20s, and he's wearing a suit. Candidate B is a Middle Eastern woman wearing a floral blouse, and she's in her mid-30s. Candidate C is a white man in his late 30s wearing a t-shirt and a blazer. And candidate D is a black woman in her early 40s wearing a checkered collared shirt. Who are you gonna hire? I want you to be honest here, okay? Go with who feels like the natural fit for a national sales director role. Maybe it's the person that your eyes are lingering on just a little bit longer. Who are you gonna hire? Got it? Good. Why am I torturing you like this? Why am I asking you this question? Well, I've had the honor of torturing about 1,000 employees with this very same question, spanning Canada, the United States, spanning industries and sectors. And I did that not because I'm cruel, but because I am the CEO of an equity, diversity, and inclusion consulting firm. And I work with companies to help them become more fair. So in our workshops, what I do is I break employees into 4 groups. And in those groups, I present them with one of these candidates. I ask them to evaluate the candidates based on their communication skills, their leadership abilities, how trustworthy they think they are, and their expertise, or their ability to do the job. But finally, I ask them a simple question. If you had to describe this candidate using just one word, what would that word be? I want you to try it. Think of your candidate. What's the first word that comes to mind when you think of them? And here's where I tell you that I'm a bit of a liar. I get to lie to people in these workshops because while everybody met a different candidate, they all hear the same thing. These candidates are actually actors, and they've been provided with identical scripts, the very same answers to the very same questions. Knowing that, now that you're in on my little secret, who do you think the most likely person was to get hired? Yeah, a lot of you are saying C, and that's exactly what I thought too. In fact, when I designed this experiment, I thought 80% of the time, candidate C, the white man, is going to be selected. But I was wrong, and in fact, I was completely surprised by what we learned. What we learned is that it depends on the industry. Specifically, when we work with analytical organizations, so accounting firms, those that are in finance, we find that they're more likely to go with candidate A, the East Asian man, who they describe as being thoughtful and methodical. When we work with more relationship-oriented organizations like healthcare or hospitality, they go with candidate B, the Middle Eastern woman, who they describe as kind and warm. When we work with more tech or more sales-driven sectors like tech, they love candidate C, who they describe as confident and competent. And I'm going to come back to candidate D, the black woman, in a moment. So what do we think is going on here? Well, for one thing, we notice that employees match the candidate that they think most closely mirrors the profile of their organization, even if they themselves don't match that profile. But there's something else going on here. Look at the adjectives. What do you notice? Kind and warm for the Middle Eastern woman, thoughtful, methodical for the East Asian man, confident and competent for the white man. Doesn't it strike you as odd? They all said the exact same thing in their interview. And yet 100% of the time, the East Asian man is described in terms of his analytical skills, and 100% of the time, the Middle Eastern woman is described in terms of her warm and nurturing personality. What drives the difference? It turns out, when we are rushing, when we lack sufficient information, we turn to stereotypes. Stereotypes that have us classify and categorize individuals. Women are more nurturing, or more relationship-oriented, or white men are more confident and competent leaders, or East Asian people are better at math, even though we lack sufficient evidence to prove that any of these claims are true. But what about candidate D? What about the black woman, candidate D? Well, despite being consistently described as qualified and competent, candidate D is almost never selected as the top candidate. It's as though people are surprised that she performs as well as she does. You know, people describe her as articulate, but she says the same things as everybody else, and yet no one else is described as articulate. They say that she's qualified, yet she's the only one that doesn't get hired. And the other word that people use is professional. And again, she's showing up with a scripted interview the same as all of the other actors. And so this brings me to the heart of the issue. When we're rushing and we lack sufficient information, we turn to stereotypes that for some of us, they're a little annoying. And for others, they have the potential to completely stop us in our tracks and deny us the opportunity of a fair chance. Now, when I tell people this story, the most common reaction I get is, "Oh, Michelle, I don't do that. You know me, this is not a thing that I do." And I hear you, I do, but this is why it's called unconscious bias. We don't know what's happening. In fact, research has shown that it only takes 1/10 of a second for us to form an impression of someone based on something as, kind of quick as a photo. 1/10 of a second is less than the amount of time it takes you to blink. How much do you think you can get to know somebody in the time that it takes you to blink? Now, you might be saying to yourself, okay, this doesn't really sound like it happens in real life. Michelle, you're running these experiments, you have these photos of the actors, and you have them doing these interviews. Does this actually happen in the real world? It does, it really does. There have been numerous studies that have shown that when you even take near identical resumes, so for example, there's one study, 169 studies were analyzed in a meta-analysis that had nearly identical resumes. Same qualifications, so same educational experience, same volunteerism, same education. The only difference is the identity of the applicant. And they submitted these resumes to a number of jobs across industries and sectors, trying to find out who is going to be the least likely to get hired or least likely to get a call back. And in some cases, the applicant was from an underrepresented group, like a person with a disability, and in other instances, they were from a dominant group, a person without a disability. And so they submitted these applications, and they found out that there are a number of groups that experience disadvantages. For example, they found that people with disabilities were 41% less likely to get a call back to interview. They found that older adults were 31% less likely to get a call back. Ethnic minorities were 29% less likely. And when it comes to ethnic minorities, there were a number of different groups that were disadvantaged. But in particular, they noted that people who identify as being Arab, Maghrabi, or Middle Eastern were 41% less likely to get a call back to interview. Now these studies, these 169 studies, span over about 1 million candidates. 1 million candidates in real jobs, for real jobs in real organizations, who had the same qualifications, different identities, and vastly different outcomes. And it's not just these groups. There have been numerous studies that show the same effects for people who are on 2S LGBTQIA, or depending on your political affiliation, or your body shape and size, your gender identity, for example. This is happening not because we're bad people, but because we're people. People who can make mistakes. But we're also people who are capable of great change. I want to tell you about some ways in which this work has been valuable and impactful by helping people to question the impression. So when we question the impression, we pause and we ask ourselves an open, curious, non-judgmental question to help us see these stereotypes for what they are, which is fiction, and not fact. One time, when I used this questioning the impression idea, was in a succession planning conversation. So I'm working with a client, and they are talking about the future for a head of finance role within their organization. Who's going to be the head of finance? And one of the leaders brings up a candidate who just meets all of the requisite skills and competencies, who seems like they would be, quite a natural shoo-in for the role. But the executive says, I think that this person, they just lack leadership presence. Hearing that, I hear an adjective, leadership presence, I think this is a perfect opportunity for me to question the impression. So that's what I did. I paused and I said, what do you mean by leadership presence? And so he thought about it, and he said, somebody who they command the attention of the room. Somebody who just has electrifying energy, big personality. Okay, interesting, I said. You're the head of finance. Does that describe you? He thought about it. No, actually, it doesn't. Oh, interesting. So is this a requirement for the role? No, it's not. By questioning the impression, the executive team were able to see that they were operating on the basis of a stereotype, that extroverts make better leaders, which is not true. And so they were able to give the candidate a fair chance to be considered. Another organization I worked with trained their managers at performance review time to question the impression. So every time an adjective was used, like, she's aggressive, the managers would question the impression by asking things like, is it aggressive or assertion? Based on what? What gave you that impression? And by asking these questions, we were able to reduce the performance rating gap between men and women by 10%. Not by lowering the bar, but by lowering the bias. And I want to double down on that point, because when we do this work, when we question the impression, we do not give unearned advantages to folks who don't have the qualifications, the skills, or the merit. But what we are doing is making sure that the way we make decisions is fair. But this doesn't just happen at work. This happens at home as well. I want to take you to a moment, for a moment, to my house at bedtime. These are my kiddos, Gabriel and Evangeline, and we're about to get ready to read a story. I've just lost the battle with my son, who refuses to wear a shirt, as per usual. And the story that they've picked out is about princesses. So the story begins. Get to know gentle Snowy, sweet Sleepy, caring Cindy, and kind Beauty. And then the story takes a twist. Listen in and see if you can catch what it is. Feisty Jazzy, brave Lonnie, headstrong Polka, and busy Tia. I felt a knot in my stomach immediately when I read these words to my kids. You see, the princesses here on your left, these are white princesses. And the princesses on your right, those are racialized princesses, or people of color. Notice how the white princesses are described. Quite soft and comfortable and nurturing, gentle. Notice the way the racialized princesses are described. Quite bold and bristly, maybe even a little challenging. And don't get me wrong, I love a headstrong person. In fact, I hope my kids are headstrong, I hope that they are brave, and I hope that they are bold. It's not that these adjectives are problematic, but what's problematic is the contrast and the consistency of this contrast. That throughout our lives, we're consistently told that people who look like me are a safe bet, and people who look like my racialized nieces might be a bit more challenging. So I have to question these impressions now with my kids. They're 4 and 6. They're at a time when they're so open, they're so impressionable. And if I don't ask these kinds of questions, if I don't help them to question what they're hearing, then this is going to affect who they play with at school. It's going to affect who they invite to their birthday parties. And one day, it's going to affect who they give a fair chance to. So what are we going to do about it? Because it's not enough to know that this is happening, right? We all have heard about stereotypes over time, and yet here we are. We have to take action. I want you to think back to the word that you used earlier when you were describing your candidate. Have that word in your mind? Has it changed? Even though now you know that it might have been based on a stereotype. Well, for most of us, the answer is no, because we haven't yet done the work. And if we don't do the work, we are probably going to go through our lives picking up on confirming bits of evidence that will substantiate or strengthen that initial perspective we had in the first place. So we have to unstick these stereotypes. We're going to do it starting today. We're going to question the impression. So every single time, no matter if we're at home, at school, at work, in volunteerism, in our places of worship, wherever you are, every single time you hear an adjective being used to describe somebody, particularly if it's negative, you're going to stop, take a deep breath, and ask an open, non-judgmental question. That person's lazy. Based on what? They're a rock star. What do you mean by rock star? She's busy. Is that a stereotype or is that a fact? Every time we question the impression, we give a fair chance to somebody who's been overlooked, somebody who's been counted out, whose diverse perspectives, experiences, and contributions are going to make our communities and our organizations better. But let's be honest. When we question the impression, we benefit too. Because you're going to leave here today, and either today or at some time this week, someone's going to notice something about you. Whether it's the way you look, the way you sound, the things you have, the things you don't have, or maybe a belief that you hold. And they're going to form an impression. The chances are really good that the impression they form is going to be wrong. And you're going to hope that that person took a moment to pause and question the impression. Because you, and we all, deserve to be seen for who we truly are. Thank you.